Welcome to Cardio Radio, a podcast of the Ohio Cardiovascular and Diabetes Health Collaborative, also known as Cardio. This is Dr. Michael Constant from the Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine, and I serve as the principal investigator for Cardio, a statewide network of Ohio's 7 medical schools. Cardio is funded by the Ohio Department of Medicaid and shares best practices to improve cardiovascular health, diabetes outcomes, and to eliminate health disparities in Ohio's Medicaid population. The opinions and recommendations in this podcast are those of the presenters and not those of Cardio and its sponsors, and are not intended to be a substitute for medical advice. I hope you enjoy today's podcast.
Hello, I am Dr. Colin Crowe, Assistant Professor of Family and Community Medicine at Case Western Reserve University, a family physician at Metro Health, and podcast lead for Cardio's Team Best Practices. Today, I am joined by Dr. Lauri Nandyal, an Associate Professor of Family and Community Medicine at the University of Cincinnati, a faculty member of the Osher Center for Integrative Health, and a member of Cardio's Team Best Practices. Dr. Nandyal's interests focus on the importance of gut health and the microbiome as it relates to health throughout the body. Welcome, Dr. Nandyal.
Dr. Crowe, thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Okay, so as we begin, of course, our listeners know that cardio focuses on cardiovascular health. It's right there in the name. And our listeners might be wondering why we're talking about the digestive system, but you are here to tell us they are very much connected. So, how strong is the evidence that cardiometabolic disease begins in the gut?
Well, there is a growing body of evidence that there's a significant connection between what happens in the intestinal tract and systemic cardiovascular disorders. Risk originates from gut-derived inflammatory processes, endocrine imbalances, and metabolic pathways, particularly through macro and micronutrient influence on microbes and microbial metabolites, outputs from the microbes, which directly affect intestinal permeability and immune activation. The liver is the first organ exposed via portal circulation, which is why gut dysfunction so strongly affects insulin resistance, dyslipidemia, and vascular inflammation. And importantly, the relationship is bidirectional. Not only does what happens in the intestinal tract influence blood pressure, glycemic control, and atherosclerosis, but hypertension and diabetes alter intestinal perfusion, motility, and barrier integrity, while medications for these conditions may further influence microbial composition and nutrient absorption.
Okay, well, that's a pretty compelling argument for the role of gut health on cardiometabolic disease. I'd like to start by understanding what role the brain has in mediating these gastrointestinal or GI tract effects.
I'm so glad you asked. The central nervous system definitely plays a role in the goings-on in the intestinal tract, despite the semi-independent enteric nervous system, or the gut's brain. We know the interface between these two brains is largely autonomic. Remember, the counterbalance to the sympathetic stress response, or fight or flight, is the parasympathetic rest and digest state, mediated through the vagus nerve largely, that cranial nerve 10. It's fascinating how much our state of mind affects digestive processes. Mindful eating, that is, eating with awareness of hunger or fullness, as well as taking the time to explore the sensory experience of food through smell and taste and texture, are certainly treatment strategies for weight management. And we know that digestion is improved when we're in a parasympathetic state. There's a close interaction between what's happening in the gut and the body's neurologic and hormonal responses to stress, meaning that chronic stress interferes with digestion in many ways, but particularly the release of hydrochloric acid and the cascade of enzymatic actions beyond the stomach.
Okay, very interesting. What about the role of neurotransmitters in the gut?
Great question. We know that serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine are all made in the gut as well as the brain. They too play a role in influencing movement of food through the digestive tract, nutrient absorption, and they impact the gut microbiome, those vast microbial communities within the intestinal tract itself. It's a real two-way highway we call the gut-brain axis. So I try to advocate for folks to slow down, to engage with food preparation and the experience of eating, rather than eating on the run all the time and just going through the motions that don't really allow us to engage those mind-gut signals.
The gut-brain axis. Okay, I like that a lot. When you were on the podcast last time, you were talking about the overlap between oral and cardiovascular health. That was episode 60. It was a real fan favorite. We can link to it in the show notes. Can you talk us through the highlights of oral health's contribution to cardiovascular health? And then maybe take us down the digestive tract even further to find other areas of overlap?
Sure. I'd love folks to review that podcast, but in summary, we know that poor dentition and gingival, that's gum inflammation, promote systemic inflammation as well as interfere with efficient digestion. This can alter nutrient bioavailability and promote even more inflammatory signaling downstream.
Right. I remember from podcast 60, you were talking about a big message for patients, and I've been finding myself repeating this a lot. Telling patients the same foods that are hard on your heart and blood sugar levels are hard on your teeth and gums. So eating well supports your whole body, starting with your mouth. I really like that summary. Okay, moving onward and distally, how about in the stomach? What linkages do we have there with the cardiovascular system?
The stomach is crucial. The stomach acid, so vitally important. Elevated gastric pH, that is poor stomach acid secretion as a result of aging, disease processes, or medications such as proton pump inhibitors and H2 blockers, impair digestion, leading to micronutrient deficiencies and malnutrition, as well as weakening microbial control. The stomach is intended to be a bath, if you will, of acid that serves as a gatekeeper. With higher pHs, that is less acidity, gastric juices are less able to sanitize the food, inadvertently enabling bacterial overgrowth downstream. Additionally, without the acidity signals, other enzymatic and chemical reactions are not as robust, leading to even more nutrient malabsorption in the small intestine. Another gastric contribution is the hunger hormone ghrelin. I always think of growling when I try to remember ghrelin's role. It's produced by an empty stomach and acts as an important hunger signal directly by crossing the blood-brain barrier into the hypothalamus and via the vagus nerve. It too may be triggered by stress, driving our experience of stress eating. We think of the satiety hormone, leptin, as a counterbalance to ghrelin, and leptin is generally produced in the fatty tissues, which serves to dial down the hunger signals over longer time frames.
All right, so take us further downstream to the small intestines. We know the bulk of digestion and nutrient absorption is happening here, but how does the small intestine influence glucose regulation, for example?
Well, we have to start by thinking about the small intestine, especially the duodenum, as such a crossroads of so many important processes. Neutralizing the gastric acid, dialing up the pH from around 2 to 4 in the stomach, closer to 6 or 7, nearly neutral, thanks to the buffering capacity of the pancreatic bicarbonate and the lipases and amylases from the pancreas. Additionally, the release of bile and CCK, cholecystokinin, in response to fatty food passing through plays such important roles in nutrient absorption and the microbiome itself. The small intestine, in addition to the digestive role, is also an endocrine organ. It releases incretins, gut-derived hormones such as GLP-1 or glucagon-like peptide 1, and GIP, glucose-dependent insulinotropic polypeptide, as well as the third, the PYY, or peptide YY. All of these regulate satiety and gastric emptying. Disruption of the microbial environment, or what we call dysbiosis, blunts these signals, contributing to obesity and diabetes.
Yeah, I think our listeners are probably pretty familiar with those gut hormones like GLP-1 and GIP, but they may be not as familiar with that term dysbiosis. So that's the disruption of the microbial environment.
That's right. The alteration in these communities of microbes impact the symbiotic relationships we have to them. And that brings me back to your question on glucose regulation. The endogenous hormones made in the small intestine, that GLP-1, GIP, and PYY, are released after eating and helps lower blood glucose by boosting insulin release from the pancreas, slowing gastric emptying, reducing appetite, and decreasing the hepatic release of glucose. So basically, they're our own built-in satiety signals. And many patients with weight loss resistance also experience bloating, cravings, and low satiety, in part due to these impaired incretin signals.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so we've discussed this dysbiosis as a disruption in the microbial communities of the gut and how they impact the hunger hormones. Besides having more or less of the good bacteria that we need, what are the other consequences of dysbiosis?
That's such a good question. We're really learning it's not just who's there and who isn't in terms of the microbes in our intestinal tract, but what they do with what we feed them and how we respond to those signals. The metabolites or byproducts made by these bacteria can definitely have an impact on our own intestinal lining repair. And when that's not working well, when our intestinal tract becomes more permeable to these potential harmful metabolites, many of them, inflammation and tissue destruction can result even outside the gut. One of the best studied of these metabolites is TMAO, or trimethylamine oxide, produced from choline and carnitine. The biggest sources of these are from our dietary red meat and eggs, and TMAO levels are linked to atherosclerosis and vascular inflammation. These nutrients, choline and carnitine, are important, and balance matters. And so some conversation about the amount of animal food compared to plant food in the diet may be worthwhile. The Mediterranean and the DASH diets are pretty balanced when it comes to the ratio of plant and animal foods, and this may be part of the explanation for their benefits to cardiometabolic markers.
Yeah, we just had a podcast on the Mediterranean diet with a lot of great information, and we'll link that in the show notes for our listeners. So we're familiar with the idea that some cooking methods may affect nutrient availability in our diet. Are there other concerns raised by various cooking methods?
Yes, we do find that many of our routine cooking processes affect the nutrient availability and even in some cases transform the nutrients. When we eat the foods raw, certain nutrients may actually be inaccessible to our own digestive tract. But with many of our heating, cooking methods, nutrients are also potentially lost, particularly with boiling them. And so if we boil a food, particularly a plant food, and then toss out the cooking water, many of the soluble vitamins may be lost down the drain, kind of like tossing out the baby with the bathwater. Rather, a soup or a stew could retain those nutrients better.
Well, I get that tossing the baby out with the bathwater is not a good idea, but don't soups and stews tend to have higher levels of sodium and cooked veggies will have less soluble fiber?
Well, the processed store-bought soups and stews can certainly be a sodium hazard. But when made from scratch, the amounts of sodium is really just what we add to the recipe ourselves. The plants aren't salty. It's the manufacturing process that adds the sodium. Using spices other than or in addition to salt can increase the taste without the added sodium. As for the effect of cooking on the plant food fibers, yes, making those tougher, insoluble fibers more soluble through heating is an advantage. Another food processing concern is flame cooked or grilling. Here too, another concern, largely with meats, is what we call advanced glycation end products, or AGEs for short, which are formed from the Maillard reaction of intense heat on sugars, that crispy caramelizing process. This is amplified during high heat dry cooking, again, particularly grilling charred foods. AGEs have been correlated with impaired intestinal cellular tight junctions, worsening insulin resistance, and increasing hepatic oxidative stress. So if and when we cook in this fashion, literature suggests that marinating foods with acidic solutions like lemon and vinegar can reduce the AGE formation by up to 50%, or pairing the meal with colorful, fiber-rich vegetables may offset some of those AGE effects. Additionally, adding fermented foods to the meal further blunts the AGE-related inflammation.
Okay, that is really important to keep in mind because grilling season is coming soon to Ohio, so we'll have to incorporate some recipes there. So we've made it through the small intestine. I appreciate that. But before we get too far, can we bring the liver into the conversation?
Absolutely. Yes, the liver is really key. Thanks again to the portal circulation, the liver is the first recipient of many dietary components, as well as gut-derived metabolites. Dysbiosis increases LPS, that lipopolysaccharide inflammatory driver, and that TMAO we discussed, as well as those AGEs. These can drive up very low-density lipoprotein, drive down high-density lipoprotein, or HDL, the good guys, increase small-density lipoprotein, and increase hepatic steatosis. Here, too, there's growing evidence that microbiome plays a role even in metabolic dysfunction-associated steatotic liver disease, or MASLD.
Yes, MASLD, the condition previously called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, or NAFLD. Our listeners would remember that one from podcast 62, so we can link that in the show notes as well. So you were mentioning these metabolites, TMAO and LPS. Tell me a little bit more.
To help lessen the impact of these metabolites on the liver, it's certainly beneficial to be aware of food-first sources in terms of those fermented foods. And there's even some evidence for probiotics and fermented dairy products in reducing steatosis severity by improving hepatic fat oxidation and insulin sensitivity.
Can you remind us what counts as fermented food and why fermented foods are important?
Sure. So fermented foods are like yogurts, kefir, sauerkraut, kimchi, as well as kombucha tea. So these are more of the popular versions. They tend to have labels like active cultures on them.
Okay, I've heard of a lot of those. Remind us what they can do as part of a healthy diet.
So patients who add daily fermented foods may lower their triglycerides, improve HDL. There's even evidence about reducing waist circumference and lowering fasting glucose. Fermented foods act on multiple pathways simultaneously, which makes them a fun additive. They increase our microbial diversity. They increase butyrate-producing bacteria. I hope we talk more about butyrate a bit later in the colon. They've been shown to reduce IL-6 and other systemic inflammation markers, as well as increase those incretins, GLP-1 and PYY, satiety signaling. And with that, we're seeing improved hepatic fat metabolism. Fermented dairy also contains bioactive peptides that lower blood pressure, reduce arterial stiffness, and enhance endothelial nitric oxide production, all of which are key for atherosclerosis prevention.
Okay, thanks for that aside. And I think my big takeaway is going to be, in addition to marinating the meat in lemon, I'm going to plop sauerkraut on the top when I grill it. Okay, let's go back to our GI tract tour and let's shift our focus for a moment to the pancreas. We talk a lot about its role in glucose regulation via insulin, of course, but what other roles does it have in this particular conversation?
The pancreas is fascinating. It's really two glands in one. The bulk of the pancreas is actually dedicated to its exocrine or digestive function, both protein and lipid breakdown. PEI, or pancreatic exocrine insufficiency, we know has a big impact on the malabsorption of nutrients, particularly fats and fat-soluble vitamins. Remember A, D, E, and K. Poor fat digestion, likewise, has a detrimental effect on the microbiome and vice versa. Dysbiosis affecting the ability to reclaim and recycle even bile salts. Another small by volume but mighty role of the pancreas, as you mentioned, of course, is the hormonal or endocrine function of the pancreas. Without an efficiently functioning endocrine pancreas, the resultant impaired glucose regulation is the hallmark of these metabolic disturbances that we're dealing with for our patients with prediabetes and diabetes. The pancreas also produces PP, pancreatic polypeptide, which contributes to GI motility and enhances hepatic insulin sensitivity. Yet another signal that may be impacted by stress.
Wow, again, so much going on there. Okay, so I think our tour has finally reached the colon.
Ah, the colon. Yes, the much less acidic, primarily anaerobic conditions of the colon are the real home of the gut microbiome. These bacteria are not really supposed to camp out in the small intestines upstream. With peristaltic mobility, that is good forward motion of the intestines, the microbes that have survived the gauntlet so far should be swept into the colon. The colon contains 10 times more microbes than the small intestine, and the colon is where dietary fermentation of fiber produce beneficial short-chain fatty acids, SCFAs, like this acetate, propionate, and I mentioned earlier butyrate. Here, too, is where microbial disturbances, that dysbiosis, lead to a reduction in short-chain fatty acids, which are made to varying degrees, again, depending on the microbial species available. Short-chain fatty acids are important for gut repair. Our own inner lining depends on these short-chain fatty acids. That cell membrane and tight junction, basically our barrier function. And when they're absorbed, these short-chain fatty acids themselves influence our immune processes. With poor intestinal repair, there's increased intestinal permeability, increased transmission of a lipopolysaccharides or LPS into the vascular system, driving more inflammatory processes outside of the intestinal tract. And worrisomely, dysbiosis may result in impaired absorption of key nutrients, such as our omega-3s, the magnesium, B vitamins, iron, and even vitamin K, and of course, vitamin F.
Wait a minute. What is vitamin F? I haven't heard of that one.
We find it handy to call fiber vitamin F. Plant food-derived fiber is also crucial. Fiber is not something the human gut can digest enzymatically, but the gut microbes themselves, largely again in the colon, are able to ferment these fibers and their metabolites, those short-chain fatty acids, not only help with intestinal mucosal healing and repair, but with that improved intestinal cell health, there's improved gut function and immune and inflammatory benefits, as well as improved metabolic functions systemically, such as improved fasting glucose. Fiber, of course, is also crucial for stool bulking, the water reabsorption, and intestinal transit time. And so also very relevant to the colon, we have to talk about constipation. Constipation isn't something most of us love to discuss, but stool retention is both physically and mentally stressful. Certainly there are contributions from bacterial imbalances, but the mechanical effort of straining to defecate, that Valsalva bearing down maneuver, which strains central cardiovascular conditions. Additionally, patients with cardiovascular problems, especially CHF, congestive heart failure, are watching their fluid intake or on diuretics, creating the perfect storm for constipation. So preemptively addressing fiber, aiming for over 25 grams a day, and personalizing fluid balance are key for these individuals.
Yeah, that's a great point. While we're talking about this fluid balance, can you talk about hydration just more globally? I know it's not always thought of as a gut issue, but as you mentioned, the GI tract is key in water absorption.
Yes, we don't talk about hydration enough, do we? It's especially relevant to our colon discussion. Even mild dehydration increases plasma osmolality, vasopressin release, systemic uric acid levels, all of which can contribute to endothelial dysfunction, worsening hypertension, and metabolic stress. Vasopressin also alters gut permeability, compounding dysbiosis and hepatic inflammation. Patient counseling should, of course, include sodium cautions, particularly for those with hypertension, but adequate water intake with recommendations for replacing sugar-sweetened beverages with water and supporting regular and easy stool transit times should definitely be on the agenda.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so thank you for that head to toe tour of the GI tract, or top to bottom tour, I guess I should say. As we wrap up, let's shift our focus a little bit to the impacts of systemic processes or therapeutics on the GI tract. We talked a little bit about this, but I want to go a little deeper here. So we know that many of our patients have GI side effects from various medications. So can you tell us a bit generally how medications interact with the gastrointestinal tract?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked, since we really do need a better understanding of how our treatment recommendations actually affect gut functioning. We know that metformin, for one, influences the microbiome. It impacts intestinal motility, and that explains some of the diarrhea that's common with metformin. It can actually lead to vitamin B12 deficiency, warranting routine monitoring for those on metformin. Diabetes itself increases the risk for micronutrient deficiencies such as those B vitamins and magnesium due to altered absorption. And the medications we touched on earlier, such as the GLP receptor agonists, have GI effects such as nausea, diarrhea, and delayed gastric emptying. That's part of the way they work, but sometimes that limits adherence as well. The DPP-4 category, those inhibitors are generally GI neutral, we're finding.
Okay, so those are some diabetes medications. What about any common antihypertensives with GI effects?
So antihypertensives like angiotensin-converting enzyme inhibitors or ACE inhibitors, the angiotensin II receptor blockers like ARBs, in general, medications that impair perfusion of the GI vascular tree can contribute to conditions that might lead to ischemic colitis, alterations in absorption of various nutrients. While our diuretics and calcium channel blockers, I think, tend to contribute to more the constipation, water balance, slowing GI transit sort of processes. Of course, aspirin and our antiplatelet medications increase risk of GI bleeding. The statins, this category of medications, may have influence on microbial composition as well and may contribute to barrier dysfunction with long-term use. And multiple medications, not just antibiotic overuse, can contribute to drug-induced dysbiosis, which is now recognized as a contributor to both GI and cardiovascular morbidity.
Wow. Yeah, a lot to consider there. Dr. Nandyal, this has been a fascinating tour of the GI tract. So many potentially modifiable factors with linkages to cardiovascular health. What would you say are your top 10 takeaways from your perspective that we could use today when we're counseling patients on dietary choices?
Well, I would summarize that number one, the gut is not downstream. It's upstream of cardiometabolic disease, particularly the integrity of the intestinal tract and inflammatory signaling. Two, the treatment of cardiovascular and metabolic disorders must address nutrition, microbiome health, hydration, and medication effects. Three, add simple interventions like increasing complex carbohydrates, that vitamin F, fiber. Four would be adding foods rich in polyphenols from fruits, vegetables, extra virgin olive oil, tea, coffee, and cocoa. Five, incorporate 1 or 2 servings daily of yogurt, kefir, sauerkraut, kimchi, or other fermented vegetables. 6, include omega-3 sources regularly, fish, nuts, and various seeds. 7 would be to emphasize good hydration and replace sugar-sweetened beverages with water, ideally. 8, support regular bowel transit time proactively, especially if medication prescribed is known to exacerbate constipation. 9 would be to utilize gentler cooking methods. All can meaningfully shift physiology. And 10, last but not least, attending to stress and preparing and consuming food more mindfully to really get the most out of our diets.
Wow. Great advice there, Dr. Nandyal, and I can't wait to share that with my patients. Thank you so much for that overview and for joining us today.
Thank you, Dr. Crowe. It was great being a part of this podcast.
And a special thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in to Cardio Radio.
This concludes today's podcast. Be sure to visit cardio.org to learn more about the Ohio Cardiovascular and Diabetes Health Collaborative.